the story about a beautiful little princess, considered to be the fairest of them all, who gets lost in the forest thanks to the wicked queen and ends up making friends with 7 insanely cute dwarves, is a true Disney classic that takes you back to your childhood. Prepare to have those nostalgic memories forever altered with these theories about Snow White's tale that will leave you regretting watching this. You have been warned. First up, the kiss of death. This fan theory, which has been swirling around the internet for quite some time, will introduce you to a different and considerably darker interpretation of the film's ending. According to the idea, the princess never awakens from her eternal sleep and dies, and her Prince Charming, who was practically our own imaginary Prince Charming when we were kids, wasn't the love of her life, and there's a very strong reason to believe he was the angel of death. Doesn't the kiss seem less romantic now that we've termed it the kiss of death? The theory goes that at the opening of the film, when Snow is shown carelessly singing around the well, the prince hears her and she sees him for the first time in the well. Basically, as the princess almost falls into the well, she sees death for the first time. Snow rushes inside the castle as she sees the prince. While we believe it's due to her shyness, the theory suggests that she flees out of fear. Not only that, but it grows darker. The prince rides up to Snow White's casket on a white horse in the film's last scene, and numerous traditions and myths indicate that death invariably rides a white horse. Adding to this, isn't it true that the prince's kiss ultimately wakes her up? Well, no. Instead of resurrecting her, the prince gives her the kiss of death. He essentially steals whatever little breath she has left in her body, and when she awakens, she's not really revived. She only stands up to say her final farewell before riding out with the prince. Another clue that supports this terrifying hypothesis is how the prince is reunited with her after she consumes the deadly apple. At the time, she is literally in a coffin. The two exchange a kiss before riding away on his white horse. This kiss of death was a means for folks to know someone had died before they learned how to take pulses. And when you die, the air in your lungs is released. According to folklore, this was death kissing you to take your breath of life. Snow White also kisses the dwarves on the head to bid them farewell, because the dwarves cannot accompany them into the afterlife. And finally, the castle they take off to appears to be heaven. Next is, Dopey and Geppetto are the same person. If you ask us, this theory is much more plausible, because not only do the two persons resemble one another, but they also have a very plausible past. The theory claims that there were always 6 dwarves. While exploring, they came across a baby and mistook it for a dwarf. He and Dopey grew up with a family who held him back by hitting him and making him do the hard labor. They then kicked him out when he got taller than them, and he walked all the way to Italy, where he began to build his own home. His harsh past also explains the odd clockwork he's been creating, including a mother hitting her child, a drunk, a hunter, and a bird that nearly gets decapitated. That sure does make some sense to us. Now, we have the cocaine theory. According to this fan theory, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is actually about crack's socially acceptable cousin, cocaine. Sure, Walt Disney's public persona was warm and wholesome, but he was also rumored to be anti-Semitic, racist, and sexist. So there's always the possibility he was snorting a bit of the Colombian marching powder behind the scenes and thought it appropriate to produce a cartoon allegorizing his drug abuse while high. After all, Snow White is slang used for cocaine. Naturally, Disney files would point out that the film is based on the Brother Grimm's fairy tale, Sneewittchen. Thus, the title Snow White is only a translation rather than a direct allusion to Disney's alleged drug of choice. Well, consider this, naysayers. The dwarfs of the original fairy tale did not have names, but Disney opted to make them happy, grumpy, sneezy, and dopey, all probable side effects of cocaine use. And then there's Doc, because continual cocaine use will almost certainly result in you seeing a medical expert at some point. Let's talk about the original Snow White. Eckhard Sander, a German scholar, reported these findings of the alleged backstory that Snow White is based on in his book Sneewittchen, Märchen oder Wahrheit, which translates to Snow White, Is It a Fairy Tale, in 1994. In the book, he speculates that the Snow White narrative was inspired by the true story of a countess and her claimed lover Philip II of Spain, and draws attention to parallels between his historical knowledge and the Disney tale. Margaret von Waldeck, the countess in question, was allegedly poisoned at an early age because politics was more important than true love at that period. Margaret had a poor relationship with her stepmother as well, which is another coincidence. Meanwhile, the Countess's hometown of Waldungen was home to a number of copper mines. The laborers were young children who had stunted growth as a result of hunger and bad working conditions. They were allegedly referred to as poor dwarfs. Next, we have Mother Gothel is Snow White's evil queen. Some believe Tangled is a sequel to Snow White, and that the original Disney villain, the Evil Queen, survived her devastating defeat in 1937. We've seen how the Evil Queen used her power to transform herself into an old hag, and how Mother Gothel utilized a magical flower to keep herself young. Aside from the old Evil Queen and old Gothel being strikingly similar, the Kingdom of Corona bears a lot of visual parallels with the Evil Queen's castle. Proponents of this theory believe the Evil Queen staged her death in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, following the old soap opera adage that if you don't see the body, they probably survived. The truth about the Queen. In the Disney version of the tale, the Queen is quite wicked, but in the Brothers Grimm version, she's an actual cannibal. She instructs the huntsman to murder Snow White, remove her liver and lungs, and bring them back to the palace for her to consume. Not only that, but she dies in a far more brutal manner than is depicted. Her death appears not to be caused by a rock, but after showing up at Snow White's wedding, where she is compelled to put on red-hot iron shoes and dance till she dies. This is her punishment for meddling with the fairest of them all. If that wasn't dark enough for you, the theory goes on to say that when Snow White is discovered and presumed to be dead, rather than in a heavy slumber, the prince carts her away with the intention of using her corpse for his own pleasure. She only awakens when the toxic apple is accidentally dislodged from her throat en route to her awful death. What is it with fairy tales and the heinous sexual abuse of helpless women? Up now, dwarfism isn't funny. According to certain assessments of the story, even though the dwarfs did not always protect Snow White, despite the characters being presented as juvenile, comical, and impossible to take seriously, they were meant to represent loving and nurturing people who cared for orphans at the time. This trend is seen exceedingly in media, with dwarfs being represented in films such as The Wizard of Oz, Austin Powers, Time Bandits, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where their dwarfism is their main feature and is played upon as comedy or fantasy. This is a concerning trend to say the least, because a person with dwarfism is rarely depicted as an ordinary human being, but rather as a cheeky individual who prefers to be ridiculed and laughed at rather than with. Snow White and the Seven Psychological Disorders. This theory truly delves into the psyche of the Disney tale, in particular of the Seven Dwarfs. It states that the dwarves actually represent 7 disorders. It details that Sleepy represents narcolepsy, Grumpy shows depression, Happy expresses mania, Doc shows a form of speech disorder, Sneezy is a hypochondriac, Bashful is antisocial, and lastly, Dopey suffers from caligynophobia, which is a fear of beautiful women. The theory also adds that Snow White herself could represent OCD. Finally, Grumpy lost his partner. This theory is sadder than anything else. It is stated that the Seven Dwarfs appear to be a cheerful group overall, with the exception of Grumpy. Why is he always so upset, it asks? Well, according to the theorist, Grumpy was once a kind person who became grumpy after his partner died or broke his heart. The TV show Once Upon a Time explored this theory by portraying Grumpy as a dwarf named Dreamy who became grumpy after learning he couldn't love a fairy named Nova. Some aspects of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs have aged poorly, but this theory endures. And that's a wrap for this video. So how much has your perception of your childhood tale changed? Do you regret knowing any particular theory? Do let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and click the subscribe button for more videos like this. See you in the next one.